So let's talk about the subtle and sometimes not so subtle nuances of surf seasons in Nicaragua. A lot of people think, because of what they see online, that Nicaragua is perfect all the time. But in the reality, it has a few very distinct seasons, and it has a couple of what we call shoulder seasons, okay? So first you've got the wet season, which runs from like May, June, until the end of October. Okay, then you're gonna have the dry season, which is gonna run from November until May or June, depending on when the rains start. Okay, so in general, the waves are much bigger during the wet season because Nicaragua gets exposed to south and southwest swell. The swells are bigger because that's southern hemisphere winter, and so there are bigger storms that come off of the roaring 40s, you know, in between New Zealand and Australia and Chile and Peru, and they send pumping swell this way. Okay, in the dry season, the waves are generally smaller. Okay, in the wet season also, the winds are generally just a little bit lighter. In the dry season, the winds here can get up to 50 kilometers per hour straight offshore, which means a lot of times in January and February, you're going to be needing some sort of rubber. Like some days it even drops into the 60s and you might even need a 3-2. A lot of people have booked a surf trip to Nicaragua in winter, northern hemisphere winter, in dry season, January, February, even March, and got here to find that it's freezing and tiny for months at a time, and that is generally the case. Costa Rica can be better during the dry season and have more consistent shores, especially Guanacaste, northern Costa Rica. But Nicaragua is actually the opposite. It tends to be smaller and colder during the dry season. So next we're going to talk about the shoulder seasons. And there's two very distinct shoulder seasons. There's spring and there's what I guess I consider the late fall, because I'm from the northern hemisphere, even though here they consider it to be the opposite. They consider our fall to be spring and they consider our spring to be fall. In our fall from the northern hemisphere in November and early December, you're going to find mostly clean, mostly manageable, pretty good waves. Actually, they don't get too big because the south swells, you can still get a big south swell, but the south swells don't necessarily pump during that time of year, and so that's a great time for like an intermediate to come to Nicaragua. The winds are generally offshore. You generally don't need a wetsuit. You might need a short top some days, but the rivers have been running during the wet season with all the rain, which means a lot of the sandbars are replenished. It means a lot of the brakes are working really well. November is a great time. December can even be a great time. January, February, March, sometimes not so much. Now in late August and September and October, that's a time that's generally not as consistent here because you're going to find a lot more days with onshore winds. That's the only time of year where you really get to see consistent onshore winds that happen regularly here because of the wet season, because of hurricanes. If a hurricane enters the Caribbean side of Central America and passes up towards the Yucatan, it's going to disrupt the wind flow across Lake Nicaragua, and that means it's going to go onshore. So even the last 2 days here, it's been kind of wonky. Cue surf clip, and it went onshore, and even now that it's offshore again, it's still with the low pressures. It's kind of funky, and that's in general by mid to late August, September, and October. Those sometimes can even be the prevailing conditions for like weeks at a time. So you need to keep that in mind if you plan on coming here during, you know, August, September, October. You might get skunked. You might get unclean waves. You might not get perfect Nicaragua that you're expecting. So now let's talk about the other shoulder season, the northern hemisphere spring, which is, you know, March, late March, April, May, and sometimes into June, even though usually by June the big south swells have started to come with a little more consistency. But the shoulder season, that time of year, can be hit or miss. It can be really good. It can still have cold days. There are lots of jellyfish, so you might want to bring, you know, some kind of jellyfish repellent and antihistamine, because you're going to get hit by sea lice. You're going to get hit with what we call agua mala. Agua mala is like the big jellyfish here that will wrap around you and sting the crap out of you. That being said, a lot of the breaks here that time of year are really uncrowded, because, you know, you're coming out of the winter season. Most of the hardcore surfers haven't arrived yet, and you can score here, uncrowded waves. The downside of that season is because it hasn't rained in a while, because the winds have been blowing, some of the sandbars are going to be depleted, which means a lot of the beach breaks are just not going to be quality. They can still be quality depending on what you're expecting, but the highest quality of the beach breaks here comes when the sandbars have been replenished by a little bit of rain, or even a lot of bit of rain depending on the spot. So yeah, keep that in mind. If you're going to come here in the shoulder season in March, April, and May, you're going to want to look for rocky spots, because the rocky spots are going to be a little bit more consistent, and the beach breaks might be like a little more closed out or a little more fat. And personally, I come to Nicaragua for the beach breaks. I don't come for the reef breaks. So, but yeah, that's just me personally. I hope you enjoyed this little seasonal guide to Nicaragua. Of course, we're talking about Southern Nicaragua, but you know, this is what people consider Nicaragua. Northern Nicaragua is a whole different animal. We'll talk about that in different videos. But yeah, if you enjoyed this guide, please drop a comment on us. Have you come during have you got skunked by coming to Nicaragua during cold weather and blasting off shores that made you have to wear a wetsuit? How about jellyfish? Have you gotten murdered by a jellyfish? I definitely have. Hope everyone's having a good day. Even a bad day in paradise is still a good day in paradise. So. Pura vida. Shredder out.